Hello, my name is Zombie, and I am the sole developer of Rogues War, a deck-building roguelike where you fight against hordes of enemies by playing War, the card game. And developing the game was definitely an experience, to say the least. This was one of my first ever projects I had ever started in Godot, and I came at it with very little experience under my belt. While I was lucky in that I had programmed things in other languages before, hell, my entire degree centered around coding, I had very little experience with working with the engine. And that led to many sloppy coding decisions that I've come to regret now. So here are a few things that if I started this project now, I would have done differently. Number 1, use resources. Godot functions mostly off of two main classes, nodes and resources. And for a good chunk of my development time with Rogues War, I completely avoided using resources because I thought they would be really hard to work with. Now I know they're one of the most simplest things to work with in the history of video game development. In case you don't know what I'm talking about, resources are at their core data containers, and you can do so much with these data containers. Godot's built-in resources include textures, animations, fonts, and scripts, though a programmer may also come in and define the class that stems from the basic resource class. All the resource class allows you to do is save and load a resource to disk. Though, I mean, there are also probably other things that I'm missing, but that's the core idea. Before, I had to manually save each variable to a dedicated line in a file, and if I wanted to retrieve that variable, I had to grab each line in said file before finding the variable. It was a headache and a half, and it also created a lot of lines of code, making my code barely readable. And it was really hard to add a new mechanic that needed to be added to a save system, like adding a new modifier, for example. Now with resources, I can add a new variable to the resource itself, and it'll automatically take care of saving it to disk when needed. It also would have set up the process it took to code all the various upgrades a player can get throughout a run. Before, I had to define every single mechanic in a formatted text file, which wasted a ton of my time because I needed to write helper functions that scanned each text file for the ID of a specific object. Now with resources, I don't have to worry about that, as I can just have everything stored in one organized database stored inside the project. It also makes creating new ones easier, as I don't have to write out an entire line of text in a specific format to get the game to recognize a new modifier or something else, like suit effects or card effects. Number 2, don't be afraid to make new classes. During the start of the project, I'm pretty sure I was allergic to making new classes, which would have helped especially with stuff like modifiers, decks, card effects, and especially suit effects. Before, I was using an ID-based system inside a bunch of text files, as I have previously mentioned, which worked for the time being, but was incredibly inefficient. Had I used actual object-oriented programming principles and made it so each suit effect was its own object from the start, I would need to use IDs and just pass in a reference to that object whenever I wanted to access its data. This still echoes on in the modern day system, as when I store the player's suit effects, I store a list of numbers rather than just a dictionary where the suit is the key and the effect itself is the value. In case you don't know what dictionaries are in Godot, they're basically just a way to store data in a more elegant way than just putting the data in a list. Each value comes associated with a string-based key. So for example, you could create a dictionary that lists each team in a game and their associated score. And the value can be of any type. Like with what I was saying earlier, I could have had a reference to a specific suit effect inside the player's own dictionary. That way, I don't have to reference a specific ID value every time I want to grab a suit effect from whatever database I'm using. I could just grab the effect itself. Number 3, use Godot's dedicated translation system. You know, I think I'm starting to notice a trend with these regrets, in that I was just seemingly allergic to learning new systems and instead stuck with trying to work with older ones. Similarly to how I defined each modifier, deck, card effect, and suit effect inside their own text files, I also defined their translations in separate text files as well. While Godot's system uses CSV files, which are basically just glorified text files anyway, I didn't end up using them since I figured raw text files were just more efficient. And boy was I wrong. It's way more efficient to just let Godot handle everything, including translation. Godot's translation system is a lot more future-proof, since if I wanted to add a new translation language, I wouldn't need to define a whole new file just to support another language. I would just add another column to the CSV files that exist already. Split up work between multiple components. Since the entries before focused on relatively recent discoveries I made, why don't we talk about a discovery I had a little ways before then? A long time ago, I used to have everything related to battles in one script, which was the main script the battle scene used. And while it was nice to have everything in one file, the unfortunate fact was that with so many functions, the file would become harder and harder to read. I would have to scroll endlessly if I wanted to find a specific function, and it would be much harder to debug as well. Therefore, I ended up splitting the different functions of the main battle scene into multiple subcomponents. For example, everything that the enemy does is handled by an enemy component. Everything that has to do with scoring goes into its own node. All the UI elements are their own node as well. Basically, instead of having one thing do all the heavy lifting, I made it so that each important action was handled by a specific module that communicates with the main scene. That way, there will be better organization, and the script file for the main scene gets to remain very tidy, since all it has to do is orchestrate all of its pieces and communicate with each of them. This also included moving global functions out of the one globals class I had. See, Godot doesn't have a global scope, but rather one can set certain scripts to be global nodes that are always instantiated first during runtime, and will always be available, so any node can reference variables and functions inside those global nodes. In software engineering speak, we call this practice a singleton, as there is a single instance of an object that is globally available, and only one instance of said object can exist at any given time. Back to the topic at hand. Basically, before, if there was any function that needed to be ran by multiple different classes or scenes, it would get thrown into the one global class I had. However, it eventually came to a point where functions would get lost in other functions, and I really needed a better organization of all the functions I needed to use for this project. Thusly, I made multiple different global classes that handle different things, like a class that handles all functions relating to cards, or a class that handles all the suit effects. And while this was an elegant solution at the time, this does lead into another complaint I have, which is, don't use so many global classes. The thing is, there are so many global classes in the project with functions that could easily just be moved into a non-global class. For example, there's a global class that handles suit effects when they activate, and what they do when they activate. However, I could easily just made it so that each suit effect has functions that can be invoked upon suit effect objects. That way, their effects aren't being handled by some third-party class. To explain it better in layman's terms, it'd be like a dog that barks, but instead of the dog barking from its own mouth, the bark comes from a disembodied voice in the sky. The dog technically does bark, but it's not the one doing its own barking. And plus, there are a few global classes that only have one or two functions. Like the SFX and Music Managers are separate classes when they could easily just be one Audio Manager class, or the autosave class that just automatically saves every 5 minutes. Some things just do not need to be separate classes, and could just be another function in the all-encompassing globals class. In short, while it was good that I ended up splitting everything into its own contained class, it probably would have been better if I hadn't split things up too much, or had individual classes handle things relating to their own data, rather than having a hand in the sky handle their data for them. The silver lining in all this is the fact that Rogue's War is still in active development. If I do get bothered enough by these issues, and trust me I will, then I'll most likely change the code to better align with the values above and values that I didn't even mention here. But I do hope that I get the point across that even with code as atrocious as mine way back when, it still created a project I'm proud of. And you too can make a project despite the lack of experience. Who knows, maybe you'll end up learning a thing or two along the way and end up being able to see problems in your own code as well. This just serves as a reminder that iteration and learning from one's own mistakes is a part of the creative process. Now with that being said, go download Rogues War on itch.io, and I'll see you all in the next video.